Welcome to the London Fortean Society, entirely online for the first time ever. Thank you very much for Conway Hall for helping us sort this out. Do please donate to Conway Hall. They're a fine charity and a unique place in London for events, the like of which that we do. My name's Scott Wood. I'm the host and co-founder of the London Fortean Society. Dave Barrett may be lurking in the background somewhere. I'm not sure, he may be busy. Welcome. So the plan is, John's going to speak for 45 minutes or so on Shapeshifters, a history. He's promised he's not going to shift his own shape during the talk. That would be a bit of a shocker. John is an award-winning author and creative writing instructor at Ohio University. He's investigated over 100 haunted locations around the world, and his books include Ghostbusters, Dark Entry, and the very excellent, and what we'll be speaking about this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are, Shapeshifters, a history. So do please welcome, I'm so used to just getting everyone to give a round of applause here, but somehow welcome in your own way, in your hearts, John Kachuba.
Thank you, Scott. I can hear the applause over here, as far away as I am. I'm sitting in my office in Cincinnati, Ohio, rather than in Conway Hall, which is unfortunate, but that is the nature of the times these days, I guess. Anyway, thanks very much for having me here. I'm glad to be here. I'm excited about this. It's the first try of a virtual presentation like this, and I think it may be the wave of the future, whether we have coronavirus or not. So what I want to talk about tonight, Scott mentioned, my new book is called Shapeshifters, a History. It's actually published by a London publisher, by Reaction Books. So it's should be right in your neighborhood. You should be able to find it pretty easily. My talk will be about that, but just to give you a quick little background, Scott already mentioned a few things about me. For the last almost 2 decades, I've been pretty heavily involved in paranormal / metaphysical research, and I've written over a dozen books. Maybe 7 or 8 of them are dedicated to the paranormal. So it's been a field that I've been very interested in for the longest time, and Shapeshifters sort of grew out of my interest in my research in ghost work that I've done. Every time I gave a talk about ghosts, people would say to me, well, what about shapeshifters? And I said, well, they're not really ghosts, but I started thinking or asking myself why the shapeshifter was such a popular sort of character, popular motif. And in doing the research on this, I discovered, as you'll see, an amazing world. When we think of shapeshifters, we think of a werewolf, sort of the quintessential shapeshifter. But there's so many different types and so many different sort of theories about why they're in our consciousness, why they're in our culture. So we're going to do that. And what I'm going to do, with a little bit of luck, is I'm going to try to work a PowerPoint presentation in here so you can have some illustrations instead of looking at my unshaven face all night long. So I'm going to switch screens right now, hopefully. So you'll see a little bit of computer pages, but bear with me, it shouldn't take too long to get that up. Okay, so that's simply the cover of the book, and as I said, it's kind of a unique, interesting cover here, again showing a werewolf. We're talking about that. But you know, when we talk about a shapeshifter, what is it really that we mean when we say shapeshifting? So there's a lot of ways of looking at shapeshifters, but basically the sort of traditional definition is a person who is capable of transforming into an animal and then transforming back into a person. Under their own volition, their own will. However, it doesn't necessarily have to be a transformation into an animal. It could be a transformation into another person. It could be a transformation into even an inanimate object. For all of you who may be sort of Star Trek fans out there, I think there's a character, you would know better than me, I'm not a big fan of that. I think his name is Odo, and he is a shapeshifter. And I remember seeing 1 or 2 episodes of the program, and in one of them, Odo was standing before a door. He's trying to get through it, and he transforms himself into a puddle, some kind of silvery puddle that goes under the door, and he materializes on the other side. So that's what we mean when we say transforming into something inanimate. So that's a very wide range of shapeshifters, for sure. Excuse me. So tonight, what I want to do is talk about shapeshifters in sort of 3 broad categories. The first is how we see them in religion, mythology, and folklore. The second is just how various cultures view shapeshifters today, how they're in our popular culture. And then the third thing I want to talk about is the psychology behind shapeshifting, which I found to be very fascinating. That could be a book in its own right, and who knows, maybe it will. So when we talk about shapeshifters in religion, one of the earliest depictions of a shapeshifter is what you're seeing on the screen here. It's a cave drawing from a cave in France, a cave called Folklore. And it's the Neolithic period. We don't know a whole lot about why it's there. The common belief is that it has to do with shamanistic rituals, hunter rituals, in which a shaman would paint the prey on a wall. In this case, some kind of a deer or elk or something along those lines. And that the hunters would gather around him. They'd all get in a sort of a ritualistic state, probably augmented by natural hallucinogenics in the environment, like mushrooms or whatever, that would possibly put them in an altered state of consciousness. And the idea was that these hunters, as they listened to their shaman, as they saw these paintings on the wall, as they ingested these materials, would actually take on the persona of the animal that they were hunting. And that makes sense. If you think about it, if you're hunting an animal and you can be just like that animal, have that same cunning, that same strength, that agility, whatever, you're right there. You're part of the herd. How easy would it be to take one of those as prey if you can literally meld yourself with those folks? So that's the idea behind this. And like I say, this drawing, it comes from the Neolithic period. Now, I don't know how well it would show up on your screen, but if you take a look at it, there's a couple of features, I think, that give an indication that this is not just an animal, but that it's a transformed human into an animal. So you take a look at that. What you might notice is, first of all, the eyes are very much like human eyes. They're straightforward, right? Most animals, like deer and everything, have sort of I don't know what the actual term is for the vision, but an eye sort of on each side of the head rather than straightforward. Bicameral vision is what we have, and that's what it's called. That deer has bicameral vision. But also notice his paws and his feet. They've got toes, and no deer that I'm aware of has toes. So what we're showing here, and archaeologists believe, is that we're showing a shaman transforming into a deer. So that's very common. This sort of shamanistic ritual, especially hunter magic as they call it, was an earlier indication or earlier origination of shapeshifters. There's a story from Siberia of a nomadic tribe called the Yukagir, and they are still around. It's still a contemporary society. They hunt elk. And they're nomads. They tell a story about how a hunter got himself into a psychological state, sort of like the old shamans, where he believed that he had become an elk as he was out hunting. And he disappeared from the hunting party. They couldn't find him. Days later, they got a report from another village where some women said that a man wandered into their village and that he was acting very strangely, walking very strangely, and that all he wanted to eat was like moss, lichen, stuff that elk would eat. They took care of him and they nursed him back to health. And when they mentioned the name of his wife, he suddenly got up on his 2 feet and came back to his own village. So for whatever reason, he was imagining himself living as an elk based on these shamanic rituals. So they go way back and they're still with us. In Icelandic history, there are people known as berserkers. These were warriors, Icelandic warriors from about the 10th century to maybe the 12th century, who, like the shamans, would get themselves into a ritualistic state before battle. There would be a lot of chanting, there'd be dancing, there'd be, again, heavy use of natural hallucinogenics, which have been found in remains, archaeological remains where berserkers were. And they would divide themselves into clans. There's the Bear Clan and the Wolf Clan, which were probably the two most notable. And you can see pictures of both those here. And what they did was, once they were in this state, again, wearing the hides of the animals, they would believe themselves to be those animals. And in battle, they were invincible. They were frenzied warriors. It got so bad that if you were allied with them, you would keep your distance in the front lines, because once they started swinging their swords and axes, anything in their way would go down. They couldn't distinguish friend from foe. All they can see was just what was ever in front of them, they killed, like an animal. They were berserk, which is exactly where we get our term for going crazy today, from the berserkers. So again, these are people who, did they really shift? Did they really transform into animals? No, they didn't. But for all practical purposes, they believe they were. They believe they had. So throughout the book, I talk about external and internal shapeshifters, basically two terms that I made up. But for external, I talk about the ones that we can see, the werewolf. When you watch a werewolf movie, you clearly see this person turn into a wolf. But then you have the internal shapeshifters, and we'll talk a little bit more about them as well, which are the berserkers and the hunters, all under the influence of something that makes them think that they have transformed. So we also find shapeshifters actually in more formal religions. If you go back to ancient Egypt, you see here three typical gods: Anubis, Hathor, and Taweret. Now these are therianthropic forms of the gods, which means that they're half human and half animal. Anubis with the head of a jackal, Hathor has the ears of a cow, and then Taweret is a hybrid. She has the torso of a woman, the head of a hippopotamus, and the tail of a crocodile. Kind of a weird combination of elements there. The reason why I put this up is because for the ancient Egyptians, they believe that their gods lived, of course, in another realm, but they also believe that their gods came down to earth to interact with humans. And frequently, the vessels, the statues, the icons, any kind of vases they may have had, or anything that had their god's image on it, or was an image of the god itself, was where that god would reside once he came down to earth. So in all practical purposes, these gods were real for the Egyptians, especially when they came down to earth as they believed, and they would come down in these forms. Now, they wouldn't necessarily shapeshift. They would be sort of these therianthropic forms, but that's the first step towards doing a total transformation or shape-shifting. And we'll see that in some other religions. When you look at ancient mythology of the Greeks and Romans, we tend to think of them so often as just interesting stories, crazy stories maybe, but interesting. But what we often lose sight of the fact is that for these ancient peoples, these weren't just stories. These were stories about their gods. So we call it mythology, they call it religion. Fine line, fine distinctions here. But for them, the gods were real. And so many of the gods in ancient Greek and Roman mythology were shapeshifters. Probably the prime shapeshifter of all time, the champion shapeshifter, was Zeus, as he's known in Greece, and Jupiter, as he's known in the Roman culture. And what you see here are two famous depictions of Zeus, famous stories. First, on the left is Zeus's abduction as a bull of Europa, as a white bull. And then on the right is Zeus's, what should we call it, liaison with Leda as a swan, or Leda as a swan. Zeus had the ability to change into he was the supreme god. He had the ability to change into anything he wanted. And when you look at the pantheon of things that he changed into, almost any kind of animal that you can imagine, birds, eagles, bulls. He changed into a shower of golden rain. He changed into a woman's husband to seduce her. And every time that he did this transformation, it was always to seduce a woman, which makes me wonder a lot about Zeus's abilities otherwise. I mean, if you have to transform into a woman, to an animal, that's a long story. We won't get into that kind of stuff. But anyway, so Zeus was very popular as a shapeshifter, but all throughout Greek mythology and Roman mythology, there's several examples. And I have a couple more that I think are very interesting here. One is Tiresias, and you might know the story of Tiresias already, but Tiresias was a prophet, a seer. And one time he was out walking and came across two snakes, and the snakes were copulating, making baby snakes. And Tiresias happened to have a wooden staff with him. And for whatever reason, he decided to just beat these snakes with the staff. And when he did that, the snakes were protected by another, I don't recall which figure, but it was another god or goddess. And so he was instantly transformed into a woman. Tiresias lived a whole nother life as a woman, probably 20 years. He had children. He married as a woman, bore children, established herself as a successful wine merchant. And then, as a woman, as you see in this picture, she was again out walking, and again saw two snakes, and again was carrying a wooden staff. Now, you would think that experience would teach you something, but it didn't teach Tiresias anything. She beat the snakes with this wooden staff again, and was instantly turned back into a man. So you have a very interesting story here of shape-shifting, and he lived the rest of his life, a long life, as a man, and finally died as a man. What I find interesting about this too is, to my mind, it's sort of a very ancient representation in a sense of transgender issues, which are very big in the United States, and I'm sure probably in your country as well. And to my mind, that too is sort of a form of shape-shifting, to become the form that you really need to be. So Tiresias is sort of an example of that. Actually, the first werewolf, as far as we know, that we can see in literature anyway, was Lycaon, who, again, this comes from Greek mythology. Lycaon was a king, had several sons, and he was sort of envious of Zeus and his power, and decided to test Zeus to see if Zeus was all that he said he was. So he invited Zeus to a dinner. And what he did to serve Zeus was he murdered one of his sons, chopped him up, cooked him, and served him as dinner. Yeah, I love these Greek tales. They're just horrible. He was testing to see whether Zeus would know what he fed him. Zeus knew what he was being fed and did not eat it, and cursed Lycaon for being a depraved individual, to say the least. And the curse was that he changed him into a wolf. And so the picture that you see here is Lycaon, turning into a wolf and being banished by Zeus. Then Zeus also destroyed his entire civilization, just to boot. But Lycaon, as far as we know, was the first werewolf recorded in history. So again, that shape-shifting motif goes back pretty far. Still talking about religion, there are examples of shape-shifting transformations in the Bible. And this really surprised me when I did this research. This is from the book of Daniel. And it talks about how the king Nebuchadnezzar, who basically was challenging God, not unlike Lycaon challenging Zeus, was transformed. It says here, he was driven from men and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird claws. The picture you see there is obviously a fanciful representation. We have no idea what happened, but clearly this person, Nebuchadnezzar, according to the Bible, was changed into some kind of a beast. And it wasn't just the Old Testament. Very interestingly, there's examples from the New Testament of the same thing. One thing that I found really interesting was the question, was Jesus a shapeshifter? There's a theologian there, Roelof van der Broek, you can see his quote there, who translated a 1,300-year-old Coptic text that was found in the Morgan Library. And as you read this, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but you will notice that it talks about the Jews asking Judas how they would recognize Jesus when they go to arrest him in the Garden of Gethsemane. How would they know him from the disciples? They say the reason why there's confusion is because he does not have a single shape, his appearance changes, and you can see according to this text, there's several different varieties, if you will, or appearances of how Jesus appears to people. Now, this is a Coptic text. It's not in the Bible. It was translated by the theologian, and this is his theory that was it possible that Jesus was a shapeshifter? There's some other evidence for that. The bottom quote there from Origen To those who saw him, meaning Jesus, he did not appear alike to all. That could be metaphorical. It could just mean that people saw in him what they wanted to see. Or it could also mean that physically, somehow, he changed himself to match the circumstances, match the people, to somehow be more connected to them. The road to Emmaus, I think, is another example, just to really quickly rehash that story if you don't know it. After Jesus' death and his resurrection, two of his disciples were walking along the road to a town called Emmaus, and they were talking about him. And as they were talking about him, a stranger suddenly appeared alongside the road and was walking with them and entered into the conversation and walked and talked with the disciples all the way into the town. And they did not recognize the fact until he finally got into town and had dinner with the stranger and the other disciples that the person was Jesus. Now, these guys were with Jesus in the desert for almost 3 years, 24/7 living by his side. Yet they don't recognize him only a matter of a couple of days after he dies and is resurrected. So the question there is, why did they not recognize him? Was again his appearance shifted in some way to hide himself from them? And finally, you have the example of the Transfiguration, where Jesus goes up to a mountaintop. He has some of his disciples with him, and he says, you stay down here at the bottom of the mountain. I'm going to go up to the top. And he goes up there, and as the Bible sort of describes it, he turns into, for lack of a better word, sort of this radiant, glowing light being. And also two disciples, Elijah and Moses, who have been long dead for centuries, appear alongside him. So he's this glowing figure, and the Bible says how the disciples have to shield their eyes. They can't even look at him. And then after that, he comes down from the mountain. Everything is quiet again. He's back to the same person. So what is that? What happened there? We don't know. What is a transfiguration? Did he transform, shapeshift into some luminous light being, for lack of a better word? And it's not just Christianity that has transfigurations. There are stories of the Buddha at least twice in his lifetime undergoing a similar type of transfiguration. In Hinduism, you have the avatars of Vishnu. There are 7 different avatars of Vishnu. I'm sorry, there are 8 avatars of Vishnu, actually. And each one of these, again, are not shapeshifters in the sense that they don't come down to Earth and spend time on Earth and then transform into other beings while they're here. But it's the one God. It's Vishnu appearing over the ages as different avatars, different representations, different people, if you will. So to my mind, that's shapeshifting as well. So you can see that the way I look at shapeshifting, I really broaden the definition of it, but I think it's important to do that because there's so many elements to consider there. So let's look at some of the stereotypical shapeshifters that are more common to us. As I mentioned before, the werewolf is probably the quintessential shapeshifter. You have Lon Chaney Jr. on the left there from the Wolfman movies. Then on the right, you have a depiction of sort of the way people talk about werewolves these days. They're a lot scarier. They're a lot more violent. They're a lot more vicious than they were in Lon Chaney's day. And then in the middle, you have a typical representation of sort of the man-beast werewolf. There are many accounts throughout history of werewolves. Tales go way back to medieval days, if not even earlier, ancient times, in fact. But there are some that I want to call to mind that are more modern, that you may have heard of, and are very interesting. In 1765, in Gévaudan, an area of France, where actually I was there in 2017 to do some research for this book. I visited these small towns in this area where in 1765, what they called the beast of Gévaudan, which was described as just a large wolf-like creature, coarse black hair, claws, teeth, a long tail, and a horrible odor, was ravaging the countryside and ravaging these villages. For 2 years, this beast roamed at will, killing at will. They estimate that it may have killed as many as 100 people, primarily children, women, the more weak among the population perhaps, but at least 100 people. And it got to the point where the king at that time sent royal hunters out to that area to try to trap the wolf or kill the wolf. They were unsuccessful. Finally, in 1767, a local hunter named Jean Kachuba shot the beast. He found it and shot it. By his account, he said that he killed it with silver bullets that had been blessed by a priest. He was accompanied by some other hunters, and when they all saw the beast, what was left of the beast after being killed, they described it as being sort of half man and half wolf. Jean Kachuba, in his own diary, said it was peculiar. He said it had peculiar feet, peculiar hands. And if you recall that early drawing from the cave painting of having toes where you should have had paws, they may have been talking about something like that. That picture you see, by the way, there's this gigantic wooden sculpture of the beast of Gévaudan on a hill overlooking one of the towns, one of the little villages that he roamed in. But more recently, in 1960, there's this interesting account that comes from, it was Burma then, it's Myanmar today, of course, but it was I'm trying to think of his name, Harold Young, who was actually a British bureaucrat serving in Burma at the time. And he became very close to the San people, who were indigenous people there. And he spent a lot of time with them, heard their stories. They had a lot of stories about a werewolf-like creature they called the Taw, T-A-W is how he would spell it. And one night he was in that village and he heard what sounded like struggling and crying, and it was a very sort of agitated sound that he was hearing. And he got up to check, and he looked into this to a window of this little village hut, and he saw this beast, as he defined it. He could not come anything closer than a beast, which was attacking a woman. Now he had a gun, and he shot at it, and he thought he hit it. He was pretty sure he hit it, and it ran off into the jungle. So he got all the natives in the jungle to go out and look for this thing. So they went on a manhunt. They beat the bushes trying to find it. They came across a trail of blood, and they followed the trail. And it took hours later. They came back to the village. They came back to this hut. The trail led into the hut, and when they got into the hut, they found a man who was shot. Now, he was the only person, Young was the only person that had a gun in the village. So it was clear he had shot this man who, at the time that he shot him, had been a beast. And it turns out the man was sort of, I guess what you would call a local medicine man, witch doctor, shaman. And so the people believed that he had changed into a werewolf to attack this woman. More recently, 1996, in Uttar Pradesh in India, 33 children disappeared over a period of about, I think like 10 weeks or so, and were killed or eaten by wolves. Nobody knows exactly what that was about or what happened, but rumors started flying through the villages up there that this was witchcraft. And there was a frenzy in which 100 people were accused of being witches and were lynched or killed. This is a true story that was actually published by the New York Times. The New York Times reporter went in there. And by the way, all these reports that I'm talking about are in more detail in the book, in Shapeshifters, so you can read them for yourself. But a New York Times reporter went to that area and was interviewing people. And they all were convinced that, yes, something evil, something, as they said, wolf-like, had carried off the children and killed them. He got the account of a young girl who was about 10 years old, who said that she saw her 4-year-old brother carried off by what she called a wolf man. And she said it ran on all fours, but when it got to him, it scooped him up, threw him over his shoulder, and ran off into the jungle on 2 legs. Her grandfather was also interviewed by the New York Times reporter. And what he said was, the government wants us to say that these attacks were done by wolves, but we know better. We saw this thing. It's a wolf and it's a man. So that was 1996. So there's still a belief and still obviously sightings, at least, of werewolves. Probably the second most common shapeshifter, I think, is the vampire. And we think of them mostly as just changing into bats. If you pardon me for just a second. Okay, so that wasn't English stout, it was just water. If I were in London, it would have been stout. So Bela Lugosi on the left is sort of the standard idea of a vampire. Then on the right, you have Buffy, the vampire slayer, who knew all about vampires and how to kill them. Vampires, again, have been around for a long time. Stories of them originating mostly in Eastern Europe, in areas of what is today Romania, in those areas back in, stories as early as 1400s, 1500s. But there is some indication that even in ancient Egyptian and Babylonian tales, there are some stories of creatures that appear to be something like what we would consider to be a vampire. So some modern tales of vampires here. In the 18th century, throughout Eastern Europe, there was a vampire scare, basically an epidemic, if you will. We have a pandemic going on right now, a virus. There was sort of a pandemic going on of vampirism. Or at least it was believed to be. People were dying of a wasting disease very often, very frequently. And the common knowledge was that this wasting disease was caused by vampires who were drawing on your lifeblood, literally your blood, also just your life energy, your spirit, your soul in a sense. Because of that, cemeteries and graves are being desecrated all throughout Europe, and horrible things were done to the corpses. Stakes driven through the heart, heads cut off, organs burned, all the things that supposedly would keep a vampire down. It got to the point where the Empress Maria Theresa at that point said that we need to do something about this, and she dispatched her royal physician to all these countries to write up reports and to investigate this. And what he found, even for 18th century, he found that a lot of it was just made up. There was fantasy, it was fiction, that there were no vampires. So based on that, Maria Theresa decreed that there are no vampires, and any more desecration of the graves will be punishable by death. And amazingly, that worked. It stopped the vampire epidemic. You think somebody would have come to their senses a little bit earlier and just said, there's no such thing as vampires, right? But that same kind of thing happened here in New England, in America, in the 18th and 19th century. One of the famous stories there comes from Exeter, Rhode Island. It concerns a woman named Mercy Brown, and you're looking at her tombstone there. Mercy Brown's mother passed away from a wasting away disease, something that they would call consumption in those days. She died in 1882. Her daughter, Olive, Mary's sister, died the following year, 1883, at the age of 20, from the same kind of disease. So the mother and one of the daughters dies. A brother, Edwin, becomes very sick. And so he moves to Colorado, thinking that the sort of fresh air and the outdoor environment of Colorado might cure him. So he's out in Colorado. Mercy Brown is the only one left at home now. Her father is also a survivor at this point. About 10 years after her sister Olive dies in 1883, 1882, Mercy becomes sick. And she passes away in 1892 from the same thing. So now 3 family members have died from some type of wasting away disease. Edwin, back in Colorado, finds that he hasn't gotten any healthier. So he comes back to Rhode Island and his situation deteriorates. He becomes sicker in Rhode Island. So the people in Exeter go to his father, Mercy and Edwin's father, and convince him that Edwin is being victimized by Mercy Brown, his sister, who just died literally 2 months before he returned home, that she is preying on him as a vampire. And that the only way they could cure Edwin would be to take care of Mercy as a vampire. And what taking care of meant was they opened her grave, they cut out her heart, they cut out her liver. Now this is 1892 in America, okay? They cut out her heart and her liver, they burned them to ashes. They mixed the ashes in a potion and they had Edwin drink that as a cure. And 2 months later, Edwin died. So it didn't work. But it's amazing how this took hold throughout New England. All throughout New England, as in Eastern Europe century before, people were ransacking cemeteries, believing that as they were wasting away from what we know is tuberculosis, that they were actually being preyed upon by vampires. And the vampires were usually family members who had passed away before. The odd thing is that tuberculosis was already known at that time in America, in the UK. We knew what tuberculosis was. And yet people still fell back on this old ancient superstition that the sickness was caused by vampires. Oddly enough, today there are vampire communities, at least in America. There are some in New Orleans, and there are some in Buffalo, New York. I don't know if there's any in the UK. It'd be interesting to know that. Now, when I say vampire communities, I need to say that these are not people who attack other human beings and prey on them and bite their neck and suck their blood. They are people who maintain that they need to ingest human blood to live. But the way it is done, it's done under very sterile conditions. It's equivalent to sort of donating blood. In fact, they have people who are donors to them, who willingly, under hygienic, sterile type conditions, will donate or give blood to their vampire partner or friend, however you want to call it. So I thought that was a little bit interesting twist. And one of the most famous vampires, of course, is Dracula. And the question is Dracula real or is Dracula myth? So on the left, you have the old Nosferatu, Count Orlok from Nosferatu, a silent movie, one of the first vampire movies. In the middle is a stamp, a postage stamp from Romania. There was a whole series of different views of vampires. Romania has they have a love-hate relationship with Dracula. They embrace it because of the tourism money they get when people come to Dracula sites in Romania, but they also are sort of abashed to think that they give so much credence to the Dracula legend. But is it a legend? On the right is a bust of Vlad Tepes Dracula, who was a 16th century prince in Wallachia, a province of Transylvania. And he was ruthless, as many medieval and early Renaissance princes were. He was bloodthirsty. He defended his borders from the Ottomans, from the Mongols, from so many people who were trying to invade and take over. So for all practical reasons, he's a hero to a lot of people. But at the same time, his means of restoring order and putting down his enemies was horrible. He was a great fan of impaling people. And at one point, he impaled 10,000 Turkish soldiers that he had captured along a roadside. On both sides, the road was lined with these tall poles with a Turkish soldier impaled on each one of them. And as the main body of the invading Turkish army came up that highway and saw 10,000 of their fellow soldiers impaled, they retreated. So he's considered a hero. But because of that, because of many things, many bloodthirsty tactics of his reputation grew to the point where people started thinking he's got the devil. Dracula, the A at the end means son of Dracula. And Dracula also translates to dragon. So people started considering him to be sort of a devil incarnate and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of myths grew up around him and about him. So I was in Romania doing some research, and I went to his gravesite, which is in a small monastery called the Snagov Monastery. It's on a tiny, tiny little island, probably maybe 2 acres in size, in the middle of a lake. And there's a long pedestrian bridge to get out to it. And this chapel pretty much dominates the whole island. You can see in the foreground there is a slab, and underneath, that's the grave of Vlad Tepes. So this is the man that people believed was the inspiration for Dracula, for Bram Stoker's Dracula, and that may have been a vampire himself. Back in the 1930s, some archaeologists came to this monastery and they opened the grave and they found that it was empty. So the question is Vlad Tepes Dracula still out there someplace? Or did somebody steal his body? Or was he never buried there in the first place? So some contemporary shapeshifters that have nothing to do with sort of the vampire or werewolf. There's a person who you may be familiar with since he's in the UK, David Icke. David has this idea that there are reptilian alien shapeshifters that live among us. And according to his theory, they came from some star cluster eons and eons ago, and basically came to Earth before there was any sort of human beings, but they mated with whatever the proto-humans were that were running around on our planet at that point. And these were shapeshifters that can shapeshift from one form into reptiles. And so now, according to Icke, their DNA had been passed down through eons, and that there are people today who carry this reptilian alien gene, which therefore allows them to change at will into sort of a reptilian style shapeshifter. And the interesting thing about Icke's theory is that he maintains that they are trying to take over the world, in that most of them have taken on incredible positions of power. For instance, your queen, Elizabeth II, according to Icke, is a reptilian alien shapeshifter. Our Barack Obama, our ex-president, is a reptilian alien shapeshifter, as was George Bush, by the way, and many others. A lot of common celebrities in the world of entertainment, sports, music, the arts, politics. There's a whole list of people that Icke maintains are reptilian alien shapeshifter bent on taking over the world. You have to wonder, though, if they're doing that, why it have taken them eons and eons to do it. I think they would have been more successful by now. Here in the US, especially in the southwest part of our country, among the Navajo, the Dene people, as they call themselves, and some other tribes like the Utes, there are what they're called skinwalkers, which are traditionally known as shamans who have the ability to transform themselves into animals, generally a wolf, not always, but a wolf. And the shamans, once they transform into these skinwalkers, as they're called, are notorious killers. Their whole rationale, their whole reason to be is to kill. So what would happen is you might, wish a curse on somebody, a horrible curse. And a skinwalker would hear that and transform and do you a favor and maybe kill that person that you had this horrible wish on. Unfortunately, then you are sort of the mark of the skinwalker yourself, and they'll probably come after you as well. The belief among some of the native peoples here in America about skinwalkers is so strong that it's difficult to get them to even talk about it. You can mention skinwalker and immediately you're going to get like a quiet response, if any response at all. The reason is they're afraid to mention them because they think that they then might become targets of the skinwalker themselves. So they're worldwide. This cartoon, I love it. This is sort of an array, a parade, I guess, of some Japanese ghosts. The Japanese have an incredible amount of ghosts, and their ghost lore is phenomenal and fantastic and very interesting. But every one of these ghosts that you see here are also shapeshifters. There are three that are very common. One is the little sort of raccoon guy in the left-hand corner there. He's known as a tanuki. And then in the center, you'll see what looks like a, well, what would I say? Kind of like a dog or maybe a kind of a wolf. He's got glasses on his nose. He's wearing a gray kimono. And that's a kitsune. It's a fox, actually. Then behind him, sitting on the shoulder, that big purple thing, the little gray guy with sort of a flat head is a kappa, a water spirit. These are all shapeshifters. And the only reason why I put this up is just to show again the range of types of shapeshifters that can be found in almost every culture of the world. There are hundreds and hundreds of different types with different histories and different stories behind them. And the shapeshifter has gone into popular culture. This is just kind of a random depiction of some brands of food and alcohol and candy and cereal and whatever that have some kind of a shapeshifter motif to them. And you see that also in books and toys, movies. You know, it's incredible just how the shapeshifter character has embedded itself in our collective consciousness. So let's look at that. What is the psychology behind shapeshifters? Well, we all know the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? Poor Dr. Jekyll. He's a well-respected physician, a good guy in every regards, but he's curious. He wonders what it would be like if he could get rid of all the bonds that holds him in place as a respected moral person. What if he can shuck off his religion or his law, the laws of his society, or his own morality? What if he can just take all that and dump it? What would happen? What would he become? Well, he makes a potion, as we know, to find out. And he becomes Mr. Hyde, this horrible, terrible, immoral person who actually ends up murdering somebody. And yet, the taste of that side that Dr. Jekyll gets has him going back and trying it more than once, to the point where the dark side, if you will, the Mr. Hyde side, takes over. And he can't fight it anymore, and so commits suicide. What's good about this story? Well, maybe there's nothing good about the story. I should say, what's important about the story is that it shows the psychology of shapeshifters and why I think that shapeshifters might resonate so much with us. Because I think in some sense, you know, we all have sort of this, maybe this subdued desire to be something else, not necessarily something evil. It could be something better, but I think so many of us have a wish, a desire. Could we be taller? Could we be stronger? Could we be sexier, more handsome, richer, you know, whatever? Or could we be more powerful? Could we be mean? Could we be rotten? Whatever type of person you are. But the shapeshifter character allows you to sort of experience that vicariously. So you don't really go off the deep end. You don't really become a schizophrenic, you know, killer, but you can read a book about that or watch a movie about that and sort of identify with the person in that way. So I think I put up some of the things, talked about these already, but why I think the shapeshifter character persists is because it offers these things. It offers us, the very last thing says, excuse for bad behavior, you know, to sort of indulge our animal side. And I'm not encouraging that here, folks, just so you understand. But it does offer us a chance to be something else. Being a shapeshifter is, in a sense, a mask, a refuge for some people. But it also offers personal transformation. It could be a good thing. If you can step out of yourself and be something other than what you are normally, you might gain new knowledge, new experiences, which could be beneficial to you. So the shapeshifter motif, the character, is not by any means just an evil character as it is so often depicted. It is both a good character and a bad character. And I think we all sort of have that. In fact, I would ask if you are a shapeshifter yourself. If at Halloween you put on a mask or a costume, or both, I could ask you why. Why do you do that? And then, why do you pick that particular mask? Why do you wear that particular costume? You say, oh, I don't know, I just like it. No, there's something more. You're putting on a new character, a new face, a new body. Why do you pick that one? Because there's something that you get out of that. You are stepping into a new role. Sometimes that role ends up in cosplay. And if you don't know what that is, you probably do. Cosplay is when it's kind of a social phenomenon that's grown up over the last maybe decade or more, where people dress as characters from comic books, movies, TV, you know, superheroes, that kind of thing. But they not only dress like those people, they take on every aspect of that person, They'll speak like that person. They'll walk like that person. If that person loves Cheerio cereal, that's all they'll eat is Cheerio cereal while they're in costume. And this cosplay industry has become phenomenal. There are cosplay conferences all around the world that attract sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes go several days. There are billions of dollars spent every year on costumes, props, all the things that you need to dress like these folks in this picture. So I think we're all shapeshifters in some way. How we reflect that is entirely up to us. Hopefully we reflect the shapeshifter character in positive ways and that we learn from it. Hopefully we don't indulge anything on the bad side or negative side. But that's it. I mean, that's what I have to say at this point. And I'm just going to go to the next one, which will just show you some of my books and my webpage, if you'd like to, my website, if you want to go to that. And I know we're going to go to some questions. So I'm looking forward to that part. Thank you.
Thank you, John. There's lots of things coming up on the chat, John. Q&A. Let's have a look. What have we got here? So we've got anonymous attendee asking an interesting question. Anonymous attendee, are you okay for us to press the live button so you can ask the question yourself? Okay, so I'm going to read out the question because no word from anonymous attendee. So, John, first question is, early human fetuses resemble other animals, tails, etc. So in a sense, we are all shapeshifters. Is it possible we've always had an awareness of this and it's affected the mythology?
I think so, because when I talk about werewolves, for instance, that's one of the earliest sort of shapeshifter characters that we have. And if you look at humankind history, what was the first animal that we domesticated? It was the dog, right? Actually, it wasn't the dog. We domesticated Canis lupus, a wolf, to become a dog. Yeah. And so I think that we have that affinity. I think that we've always had that sort of affinity for some animals, and that maybe there was some kind of wish fulfillment in a way. We've certainly learned from animals, and I wonder if they've learned from us. What have wolves learned from us? Do they think that they can shapeshift to us too? I don't know. I'm not sure it's answering the question, but I think that's what we're getting at with that question.
Okay. Another question here from Lauren McNemony. Really interesting take that, for example, masks, cosplay, even religious figures are shapeshifters. What reactions have you had from the purists out there? I don't know whether that's religious purists or cosplay purists, just purists. That's right. Purists in general.
Right. Well, in terms of the masks and cosplay, most people that I know who do those things have been okay about this. Said, well, yeah, it's fun for us, and I don't think they think as deeply as I do about it. However, the religious figures, I've had some pushback on that, as you can probably imagine. I was surprised to see that my book was reviewed in a journal that comes out of the UK, but has been recently, I think for the last 5 years or so, also published in the US. And it's a Catholic journal. And I think it's the Catholic Herald, and I'm not 100% certain. But they reviewed my book and said, oh yeah, interesting book. We like the parts about the vampires and werewolves. We're not too hot about the part about Jesus. So, but that's it. Other than that, people have said, well, that's an interesting point, so.
Okay, thanks, John. Suddenly lots of questions. Let's see how we do for time with these. First in, a question from Caitlin. Do you think the fear associated with so many shapeshifters, example, werewolves that might attack us, is related to our own discomfort stroke fear, with the idea of what might happen if we try out our alternative personas via shapeshifting?
Not sure I'm following that.
I probably read that out really badly. Sorry, John.
Sorry, no.
Do you think the fear associated with so many shapeshifters, for example, werewolves, is related to our own fear of discomfort or what might happen if we try our own alternative personas?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's the whole idea, is that the shapeshifter persona, as I just said, that we identify that. We identify with the fact that, yeah, I could change it. Wouldn't it be great if I could change? So I think the fear that we have of werewolves or whatever reflects maybe very much a fear of what would happen if I were actually capable of changing. What would I change into? And then other fears. Could I change back? You know, what would happen? Would I like it? And how would I act? Would I be negative? Would I be a positive person? So yeah, I think very much. I think it's a transferable fear, you know, from that character of the werewolf to taking it inside and saying, yeah, boy, you know, if I did that, that might be what would happen. And I'm not sure I want to do that, as if we could do it. But
Okay. Okay, next question. This is from Arjan Gavecki. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Shapeshifters don't often appear in fantasy novels. Why do you think this is the case?
I would
Is that the case?
I would disagree with that. I know a lot of fantasy writers, and I know a lot of them that do use shapeshifters in there. You know, shapeshifters appear. I didn't even talk about it in this talk at all, but they do appear in fairy tales. I mean, that's, you know, there's a lot of shapeshifting going on in fairy tales, folk tales, and I've certainly seen it in fantasy novels. Yeah, I would just disagree. I think they're there. Maybe not in the ones that this person is reading. That's possible, sure.
Okay. Any recommendations on fantasy novels with shapeshifters in them off the top of your head?
Not really off the top of my head.
Okay, that's fine. Sorry to put you on the spot like that. Do you know any examples of non-human creatures becoming human? Which is Helena, I can only think of quite negative stories like The Little Mermaid. So the other way around, fish becoming humans or mermaids becoming humans.
Right. Yeah, there are, well, again, there are shapeshifters. Mermaids are a great example when they do that. There's also I'm drawing a blank here, selkies and what are the other water creatures, mostly in your area, in the UK and Ireland and Scotland. Selkies, I'm trying to think what the other one is. Somebody will probably know out there and tell me. But they come on shore. They're usually in the form of seals or something, and they'll come on shore, lose their skin, take on the form of a human being. And frequently they'll marry, either, you know, a woman or a man, depending on what their gender was. And they'll live on land for a while, and then at some point they go back, they get their skin back, and they go back into the sea, and they return to life as a seal or whatever. Selkies, what's the other one? It'll come to me. But
it'll come to you. Arjan, if you look in the chat, there are lots of recommendations of fantasy books with all sorts of animal to human transformations, frogs into princes, though they did start out as a prince,
sure, yeah.
And all other manner of things. And I'm just going to get rid of that question. Next one is from Karina Fenton. Hey, Karina. Slightly off topic, but I see that you've done a lot of ghost hunting in Ohio. Did you ever investigate any site at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio? I studied there for a year, and I've been really interested to see if there's anything you discovered about the rumors surrounding ghosts here, and also the shape of the pentagram of the churches. And also the shape of the pentagram the churches there are meant to make if you draw a line on a map between them. That's an awesome question.
So I'm smiling because I taught at Ohio University in Athens for 8 years. I lived in Athens. I know all the sites that she's talking about. In my book, Ghost Hunting, and actually in both Ghost Hunting Ohio and in the follow-up, Ghost Hunting Ohio on the Road Again, both those have stories from Athens. The most famous one is the Athens Mental Asylum there, which is now part of Ohio University. And there's a lot of tales that come from that. But to address that pentagram, if you look at a map of Athens, Athens, by the way, for your audience, is a college town. It's a university town. And Ohio University has about 20,000 students on campus. It's a very small town. If the university wasn't there, there'd be nothing there. And it's in the southeast corner of Ohio, which is Appalachian Ohio. It's very rural. All the towns around are very small. So it's a very isolated community. But those pentagrams, there's a story that that you can map out the cemeteries and come up with a pentagram, you know, the sign of a witch or witchcraft, right? There are dozens dozens of cemeteries in Athens, mostly just small family plots on, old farms. You'd bury your family in your backyard, And so they had these things. You can map out a pentagram. You can map out a square, a rectangle, a triangle. You can map out any geometric shape or any ungeometrical shape you want looking at that map. So I don't hold any credence with that particular story. But Athens is loaded with stories. And so if it's amazing that she studied there. I don't know if it's coming from the UK or from here in the US, but Go Sing in Ohio and Go Sing in Ohio on the Road Again both have stories from that area.
Excellent. There was a shout out to people from Ohio from, I think, Caitlin. I'm from Athens. Shout out to Ohio folks. So, oh hi to Ohio folks. Right, anonymous attendee would like to know, can you speak to the relationship between mythology of shapeshifters and transgender history?
That's an interesting point. It's a good question. I do think, as I said, I do think Tiresias, the story of Tiresias, is sort of an early example of that. Now, that's not how it's presented, but certainly it's a person who, against their will, by the way, they were changed by the gods, or into male, female, back to male again. But it's an interesting thread. I'm not sure that I came across other examples of that from mythology or anything that were so striking as Tiresias. It's something that I'm looking at a little bit, but I also want to be careful how I do that. I have transgendered friends, I have gay friends, straight friends, and it's a touchy subject, and I would like to talk about that more with more, what would I say, without making it sensational, making it seem like folks that are transgendered are some kind of strange beings or something. That's just not the case. So I haven't done a lot more research on it, but I do think it's an interesting question, and I would be interested in looking at it more.
I think I might get the name wrong here. Felgon of Tralles' Book of Marvels or Book of Miracles is something I read a few years ago that had sort of some ephemera at the back of it, including a story of a husband and wife who were arguing about who enjoys sex, which one of them, the husband, men or women in general, and they go to Zeus with their argument. Would have been Zeus with their argument, who swapped their genders, and after swapping genders and then swapping back to solve the argument, they agreed that women enjoy sex more than men in general. Oh. I don't know if that counts as that. I believe The Hounds of Love by Kate Bush is based on that legend, but that's just me going off on one. We've got possibly everyone. I'm really sorry. More questions than we may have time for, but let's see how we get on. Next question is probably a really, really straightforward one. John, do you believe in shapeshifters?
Well, I talked earlier about internal and external shapeshifters. I certainly believe that it's possible for people to think that they have changed into something. Actually, in my book, I didn't talk about it so much, but I have some case studies from 19th century, even the 20th century, of people who believe that they had changed into primarily wolves, usually wolves, and the condition called lycanthropy, and actually committed murders and everything else, believing that they were wolves and doing that in wolf form. So I believe that's possible. I believe that people can certainly be convinced that they are something other than human and then act out accordingly. I find it difficult to believe that, people can sprout hair. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe.
We can certainly sprout hair.
Yeah, right. But I find that, a little bit implausible.
Okay. Let's have a look. So the next question is from Becky. By looking at shapeshifters in modern culture, specifically vampires and werewolves, have become more and more sexualized. Think Twilight, Buffy, True Blood, Underworld. Do you think it's just the animalistic nature that people are drawn to? And do you think our interest fluctuates then in response to how conservative our society is?
What was the first question before that one?
Do you think people are drawn to the animalistic nature of werewolves and vampires as they become more sexualized in our culture. I mean, there's always been a sexual aspect to vampires in particular, but
Right, right.
since they became literary creatures. But vampires, sex, drawn to it, and is that a response to however? For example, Dracula came out obviously in Victorian Britain, and is quite sexy for its time, though not as
Right.
sexy as some of the books that also came out in the same year. It was quite sexy. Do you think people are drawn towards sexuality of these sort of inhumanness of werewolves and vampires? Sorry,
Yeah.
Becky, I'm paraphrasing. I hope I'm getting it right.
No, I think it's true. And actually, even earlier than Dracula was Camilla, the novel Camilla, which was a female vampire, and who actually had a lesbian relationship, was in love with a woman. This is pre Bram Stoker, so there's that, and that was pretty sexy. And yeah, I mean today the vampires, they're all these sexy, glamorous, rich, cool people, right? Which isn't always the way it was. But I do think that again, I think it's an outlet for us. If society is more conservative, I'm not sure that it is. Depends what society you're in. But if it is, then I do think the more highly sexualized shapeshifters, whether they're vampires or werewolves or whatever they might be, I think again it offers you a vicarious thrill. I think it offers you to partake, just as you do as a shapeshifter. It offers you a chance to step into that role and think, oh, that's pretty cool, because you can't act that way or be that way in your own society, which again is the role of the shapeshifter, whether it's in literature, whether it's in film. It's to act as, I think, in part anyway, as a vicarious safeguard to release your own personal feelings, emotions, fears, whatever.
Okay, I'm going to try something here. So Janie's got the next question. Janie, I'm going to press the allow to talk button. If you don't want to speak, let us know. But Janie, do you have a question? Could you answer your question and turn your mic on? Otherwise, I'll read it out for you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. It was excellent. Unfortunately, my question was more of a repetition of a question that's already happened, which was around the shape-shifting of gender. But I also had a second question, if I'm allowed to ask that, which was, you don't mention the devil in, or you haven't mentioned the devil. And the devil is obviously quite a famous shapeshifter. And I find it quite interesting that you mentioned Jesus, but not he's a bad brother, as it were.
Yeah, give equal time to the devil too, right? I mean, so no, well, I think it's right. It's a good point. Certainly, there's many stories of the devil being in the form of whatever animals, other people, possessed people, have the devil in them supposedly. So yeah, there's that. Why didn't I mention that? Probably just because I consider that more a a mythological figure, but then I also wrote about mythological figures too. So no, maybe it's something that should have been in there. Next book. I'll put it in my next book.
Okay, Matt White, do you want to answer your question? I'm going to allow you to talk. And if you don't worry, I'll just read your question out.
I mean, no. Hello, can you hear me, John?
Yes.
We can
Awesome.
hear you.
Thanks very much for the talk. Really good, and thanks for sorting it out as well, Scott, and everybody. Question I have.
Thanks to Jeff more than anyone, who's invisible.
Thanks, Jeff. My question was about, I guess, to do with kind of consent within shapeshifting. Where do you see like the crossover with that, with transformation and shapeshifters? You spoke about like fairies and the fae, and they transform people, as opposed to people actually shapeshifting themselves.
Okay, yeah. So the traditional definition of a shapeshifter was somebody who had volition, that they could change on their own, that they controlled that whole process. Whenever they wanted to, they can transform into something, transform back whenever they wanted to. I make a distinction in my book about how in the early days, sort of going back again to Greek mythology, almost all the shape-shifting there was either done by the gods, or when it happened to a mortal, the mortal did not control it. The gods did. So it was as punishment, sometimes as a preservation, sometimes to save somebody. A nymph is being chased by a god, so a god will change that nymph into a tree to save her virtue, So earlier on, it was always the power of the gods to shapeshift. So mortals, us poor humans, were always at the will of the gods. But as I write in the book, as our society advanced technologically, scientifically, we just became more enlightened. A lot of the old gods got clay feet, right? We didn't buy it anymore. But we still had people that we thought were maybe magic, witches, shamans, wizards, you name it. We still had these people, but now they're mortals. So now they're changing at will, but they're mortals, they're not gods anymore. And so that power devolves, from being divine power to a mortal power, but to mortals that have some, extra abilities, supernatural abilities, if you will, but they're not gods. But still the mortals, there's still poor mortals that are at the mercy of now the witches and the sorcerers and the shamans and whatever, if they want to do that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, it does definitely. Thanks, John.
Okay, sure.
Okay, Mara Frampton, again, you don't need to speak, but we're allowing you to ask your question. Hello.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask about a question about the way often you see a vampire or a werewolf depicted as kind of giving into their animal instincts or base urges. Often you see in a film vampires being they're sort of like kidnapping virgins and things like that, so it's like base sexual instincts. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
I didn't quite hear the last part of that. In movies and films, vampires are depicted.
Often kidnapping virgins, young women.
Okay.
How
Okay, yeah.
I'm interested in the psychology of that, I guess.
Yeah, kidnapping virgins. Well, so I mean, again, I think that's part. That is not necessarily anything in sort of standard vampire lore. I mean, vampires didn't matter. They would take anybody. I think, again, this is part of the sexualization of that type of figure, the vampire figure, again, for literature, for books, for movies, because we're interested in that. I mean, sex sells, right? And I think that's what it's about for the most part, because all the research that I found in terms of vampires and werewolves was that they weren't sexual predators. Let's put it that way. It didn't matter. They were predators. They didn't really care so much what they preyed on. Women, men, children, it really didn't make much of a difference to them. But when you get it in literature and movies and all, people that produce those take some liberties and say, well, what would really sell? What if we had this really hot virgin that the vampire goes after? And they're right, it sells.
Cool, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So R. Willis, next. R. Willis, you've got a question about Jung, so we've now hit the allowed to talk for you.
Hello, John. While I was listening to you, it put me in mind of the shadow side that Carl Jung mentions in his psychology. And I did a quick Google and I found there's a whole Jungian archetype, which is the shapeshifter. And I just wondered if you knew much about that. I don't know much about that. I don't want to put you on the spot. But I just wondered if you had any comments you wanted to make.
No, other than Jung is mentioned in the book a few times with some of his theories, because he did have these archetypes, and the shapeshifter is one. And the shapeshifter, I mean, it's a long story, and I don't have, I can't talk entirely about Jung and the shapeshifter here. But the idea again is about transformation. It's about change. So it's about growth. It's about change. It's about transformation. It's a positive virtue, which was I was trying to get sort of toward the end of my talk, that shapeshifters, despite the overwhelming depiction of them as werewolves and vampires, they're not necessarily evil. And they do represent positive qualities such as enlightenment, learning, positive change, positive transformation. And that's all part of what Jung talks about when he talks about the shapeshifter.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much.
Okay, we've got 9 open questions and about 8 minutes left. So we may not get to all of them, but let's have a look next at, I'm going to go to Alice D, because Alice D, just bear with us. Are you still with us, Alice D? We've hit allowed to talk for you. Are you with us, Alice?
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Thanks so much for the talk. It's been brilliant, and thanks for persevering with the technology. It was well worth it. Just some thoughts on the way that children that were brought up in the wild, the sort of little Mowgli's, Romulus, Remus, children that were really found that were reared by wolves and reared by apes. Has that ever crossed into the thinking around shapeshifting?
No, probably not. It's interesting because those people would certainly have animal qualities. You know, I mean, raised by wolves or whatever, they would learn how to be an animal. So in a sense, I guess that's shapeshifting. But the thing is, once they're back in civilization, they do shed that. You know, they do become human again. So I don't consider that quite a transformation. Well, I mean, in some ways it is, but I wouldn't really classify that as a shapeshifter per se.
Thank you.
Okay, just going on the list, Yasani, or we're going to hit your button. Can you hear us, Yasani? Hello. She's gone. Okay, so Yasani's question was there an obvious economic basis for the Eastern European witch hunts, that as there was, for example, the English witch hunts around the time of the enclosure of the commons? So economic or political reasons for the vampire hunts, John?
Well, I think part of the witch hunt rationale almost everywhere, including here in America when we had our witch trials in Salem and things like that, was more males trying to make sure they had control of their society. Frequently, you know, what was considered a witch were frequently called wise women. They were healers, they were herbalists. You know, they weren't necessarily sorceresses that were condemning people and trying to poison them or whatever. They were healers a lot of times, which, you know, kind of rankles a male medical society and medical professionals and scientists. And religion too. So I mean, there's a lot of not so much political, maybe just social reasons for witch hunts for the most part. And really, I just think it's tamping down the power of women. That's how I see it. I don't know if that's economic. Maybe it is too, I suppose.
Okay. Ria Burgess has got quite a mighty question. Are you still there, Ria? Ria, we're going to open up your microphone. Are you there, Ria?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. You're quite...
Am I far away? Am I a bit closer now? Is this all right?
That's great. We can hear you fine.
Fabulous. Okay, thanks for choosing my question. I wanted to ask John, do you maybe think the reason why shapeshifters have had such a kind of resonance throughout humanity over time, and the reason that we're maybe so obsessed, could be connected to the fact that from the moment we're born, we all undergo metamorphosis. So our bodies change as we grow, we go through puberty, we then become altered due to issues such as illness or trauma, which is maybe a bit kind of temporal at the moment, given what we're all going through. And we're forced at different times in our lives to think about the frailty of our own bodies. So could shapeshifting kind of be a parallel way of people explaining or addressing their own metamorphosis in a way that makes them maybe feel a bit more powerful or in control? And a slightly off-topic question, are you also a secret cosplayer who, you know, assumes the form of a unicorn called Sunbright Happy Hooves or something? You seem to know a lot about it.
That's amazingly specific.
Well, it's an interesting question. And I have to say, I mean, we do change, right? I forgot exactly how often it happens, but every single cell in our body, dies. Every single cell, right? Billions and billions of cells. So each time there's a new creation, there's a new addition of each of us. I don't know how many times in our lifetime, but we literally recreate ourselves entirely. So we do shapeshift. I mean, you're right. We do transform continually throughout our life. I hadn't looked at shapeshifting as sort of a metaphor for that, or as something to maybe give us comfort, if you will. But I think it's valid. I think your point is valid. It could very well be a way for us to sort of deal with our own shifting, which of course is eventually going to stop. We are mortal, so it may be a way of sort of dealing with our mortality in some sense. It's an interesting question, though.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I think we've got time for one more, which we're going to go to Catherine Fitzgerald. If you're still there, Catherine, bear with me. Okay, Catherine's question was, as well as werewolves, did you research about dog-headed people, particularly St. Christopher, the Berber Christ bearer? Possibly a mistranslation or something else? Did the church comment on it? Wag's tail.
Wag's tail. So in America right now, there's been sightings, mostly in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin area, sort of that area, of something that people are calling dog men. And the way they're described is, human in every aspect except for a canine head. And there's been a lot of reportings of these, a lot of sightings of these creatures, I guess. So we have them. The St. Christopher thing is interesting because I had forgotten completely that is sometimes depicted that way. I grew up in a Catholic family, and I remember, St. Christopher is the boatman, not the boatman, but carrying the Jesus child on his shoulder across the river. That was his thing. But I've completely forgotten about the dog head thing, so I don't have an answer for that one. But yes, basically there are reports of dog-headed humans, I guess is how to say it, at least in the United States. I don't know if you're seeing them anywhere over there. And these are recent. These are like within the last couple of years.
There is a UK Facebook group for dog-headed men,
Okay.
but it's the black-eyed children we got here a little bit, but dog-headed men not so much. We do get the occasional actual werewolf sighting though, like Old Stinker and one in Camberwell Cemetery in the 1970s.
He's in my book.
Old Stinker.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had a great talk about him last year at an event that actually was at Conway Hall. So 'tis a fascinating tale. I think let's call it a night. I think everyone. Thank you very much for coming along and attending. If you have not already, do please donate to Conway Hall. But thank you so much for those of you registered and have already donated. I've just agreed this afternoon, the details aren't up yet, but the next talk will be on the 12th of May, which will be Liz Williams speaking about miracles in our own making, a history of paganism. So we're very much on the histories at the moment. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for Jeff for helping out. Thank you very much, John Kachuba, for giving this talk. It was an absolute pleasure to meet you over 4G. Thank you, everyone. A round of applause to all that are all involved. We're the London Fortean Society. Do please check us out. We're on Facebook, Twitter, the web, #Fortean London for any tweets. And thank you very much. It's been a great night.